And Bruce Hoffman is joining us now from Georgetown in Washington. And Bruce, I can't think of anyone better, quite frankly, to walk us through what we're looking at right now as we anticipate sort of the landscape for terrorists in 2025. Really interested to know from you, first of all, when you heard news of this latest ISIS inspired attack, as they're calling it, in New Orleans at the beginning of the year, what went through your mind?
I hate to say it, but I wasn't surprised. And the reason I wasn't surprised is that 2024 was really the year of ISIS's resurrection, at least in international terrorist terms. There were five significant attacks or derailed attacks. Started the new year exactly a year ago in Kerman, Iran. Iran is a police state, yet ISIS, in particular ISIS-K, their branch in Afghanistan, ISIS-K, stands for Khorasan, which is the ancient Arabic name for that part of the world, carried out an attack, the fourth anniversary of the killing of Qasem Soleimani, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps commander. Two suicide bombers killed over 80 people. That to me was a wake-up call. I mean, ISIS-K we thought was on its back feet, certainly when we left Afghanistan 3 years ago. The fact that it could pierce what would have been, I would think, a very secure environment, completely embarrass and humiliate the Iranian government with an attack on one of their most venerated figures. Now, admittedly, it was just cross border, it wasn't a huge distance. But then there was an attempted attack on a church later last January in Istanbul that was foiled by a very alert police officer who lost his life. And then, of course, last March, we had that terrible attack at the Crocus Music Hall in Moscow, where four gunmen killed 130 people. And what worries me the most about ISIS is they've shown a proclivity over the past decade to attack what I would call celebratory events. In other words, concerts, sports events, major national events. In other words, events that were high visibility, but also where there were lots of people. There was public access, which meant they had a way of getting in. Just think about last August when the Taylor Swift concert had to be canceled in Vienna, Austria. But you can go back to the attack in Nice on Bastille Day in 2016 on a promenade when people are out on a national holiday in beautiful weather enjoying themselves, and 80 persons are killed when a truck mows them down. The terrible attacks in November 2015 at the Bataclan, where there was a heavy metal concert, and then at the National Sports Stadium, where France and Germany were playing a very important soccer game. So you see this pattern, the Ariana Grande concert in May 2017 in Manchester. And then the other reason I wasn't surprised is last October, the FBI fortunately thwarted a plot by someone connected with ISIS living in Oklahoma City who was planning to stage an attack on Election Day. So this ability of ISIS in the past year to project terrorist threats overseas had even come to the United States.
Yeah. And there are two kind of aspects to this. There's the ISIS as the organization, where there is communication and there is direction about planning attacks. And then there is the ISIS inspired, which has always been a thorn in the side of law enforcement, because you don't have the communication in the same way to be able to track and to be able to sort of understand what they're planning and when and where, which are, of course, really critical for stopping these attacks before they happen. How are you thinking about sort of how the terrorist groups today are functioning in terms of how they're communicating with each other? And then how are you thinking about the ISIS inspired attacks, Bruce? I mean, what do you do in that case?
You're absolutely right. The ISIS and even other terrorist groups proceed on parallel tracks. On the one hand, they'll organize or orchestrate terrorist operations. So the attack last March at the Russian concert venue, four men obviously trained, prepared, deployed by ISIS. But then you have an incident such as the tragedy last week in New Orleans, where an individual is somehow, and we still don't know,
Yeah.
inspired, motivated, and ultimately animated to carry out an act of violence that is clearly situated within the context of ISIS. Otherwise, he wouldn't have had the ISIS flag, which even almost a week later is to me the biggest mystery. How did he get that flag? I mean, that's not something you order on the internet. We now know that he made two reconnaissance visits to Bourbon Street to New Orleans, and also had traveled to Cairo. Maybe that's where he got the flag. We don't know, but this is quite interesting. But terrorist groups are deliberately, I think, pursuing this parallel track because, of course, just as you described, immense resources of intelligence and law enforcement is consumed attempting to identify these quote unquote lone wolves or these lone actors who don't have the footprint or don't have the logistical or operational tail of an actual terrorist organization planning and plotting an act of violence. And you can see that it's very easy to be overwhelmed by the chatter, the noise, and not realize what is a threat. Or someone like Jabbar, the perpetrator of the New Orleans attack, where we're still completely uncertain how he became radicalized and what actually compelled him to carry out what clearly was a planned and premeditated attack.
Undoubtedly. The Cipher Brief spoke with the outgoing, at the time, director of the National Counterterrorism Center, Christy Abizaid, just a couple of months ago. And she said we're facing an incredibly difficult and complex terrorism environment today. She listed Sunni jihadist terrorists, domestic violent extremism, Iran-sponsored terrorism. The current director of the National Counterterrorism Center, Brett Holmgren, said that the U.S. is now entering a new phase of the global terrorism landscape. It feels like, and you and I go back quite a ways. I remember talking to you not long after 9/11 happened, and it was a real wake-up call. I'm hoping you're going to tell me you don't see another wake-up call coming in the future, but it sounds like maybe you do.
Unfortunately, I think that's the nature of the terrorist threat is it ebbs and flows, obviously, like most phenomena. The problem is when it ebbs, we become complacent. And for many people, the ISIS threat was in the rearview mirror. How many times has former President Trump, President-elect Trump, President Biden said that we defeated the caliphate, that we eliminated the threat from ISIS in the Levant, in Syria and Iraq? But what we've seen is this ability of a group like ISIS to regroup and reorganize and to be able to still, what alarms me is I expect them to be active in the venues they historically have been active, whether it's in the Middle East or in Africa or South Asia. But the fact that they've been able to operate in two police states, Iran and Russia, for example, that they've been able to strike in Turkey, nearly succeed in carrying out an attack in Vienna, and now that they're in the United States, I mean, shows that we can't afford to be complacent and have to be vigilant. As you just described, a waterfront of threats that the previous two NCTC directors have described that is both foreign as well as domestic. And extremists in the United States on both ends of the spectrum, but also an array of Islamist groups, whether they're Sunni or Shia.
Yeah. Let's talk about Syria for a moment, because obviously what's happened there with the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad, the takeover of the government by this new group that has traditionally had in the past some ties to al-Qaeda, there's a lot of concern and nervousness about what might happen there. What would you be looking for right now on the ground, or I'm sure what are you looking for right now that's going to give us some indicator as to what this new government is going to, I guess, allow or be able to control in Syria, and the opportunity that any kind of vacuum might present for these groups to really thrive there?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me start with the vacuum because I think that is a real danger, and it was another reason why, although I wasn't surprised by New Orleans, was still shocked by the carnage and that this occurs on New Year's Day when people are celebrating. But why I wasn't surprised is terrorism never occurs in a vacuum. It always reflects the currents in societies. It always leverages off of conflicts in other parts of the world, takes advantage of political polarization, for example. And in Syria right now, look, ISIS's raison d'etre, apart from creating this transnational caliphate that was ruled by Sharia law, was also to overthrow the regime of Bashar al-Assad, to wipe away all of the anti-Islamic, apostate dictatorial regimes, precisely like the Assads. They didn't do it. They failed. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham succeeded. Well, no terrorist group will willingly ever go into oblivion, will ever become irrelevant. So I actually was very concerned that because of what's going on in Syria, ISIS was out to reassert itself, probably in another corner of the world, to show that it's still relevant, to show that it's still there, and to try to steal some of that limelight or thunder from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. From my perspective, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is going to experience, I think, considerable difficulties in gaining control over Syria. There are a number of different factions, armed factions there that are backed by various states that aren't willingly. going to necessarily subordinate themselves to HTS. HTS's pedigree suggests a more nefarious intention than they might be admitting, or certainly they've tried to rebrand and refashion themselves. That is certainly clear. They say some of the right things, but we still have to remember that the core leadership of HTS were all former Al Qaeda.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, these were all people that swore allegiance to Al Qaeda, that went off to Iraq to fight, including al Julani himself, who has, without, I think, much doubt, has the blood of U.S. service personnel on his hands because he fought with Al Qaeda in Iraq in the 2000s. So, have they really changed? I'm skeptical, and there are certainly signs there that their tolerance for minorities, for other religions, only goes so far, especially for women. Um, I suppose we'll see, but I think we do have to be very cautious. We've sort of seen this movie before. If you reread the great book by Kim Gaddis, Black Wave, I mean, her chapter describing the revolution in Iran, I mean, it reads like, except for the fact that there was no social media back then, instead it was audio cassettes of Ayatollah Khomeini. The whole thing sounds exactly as what is played out in Syria today.
Mm-hmm. It's actually somewhat disturbing when you do take a moment to look back and see that we actually have been here before, and we still haven't figured out a way out of this yet. Not to minimize and say that these are easy problems, because they're most certainly not. When you look now, at what's happening in Gaza, many folks have said that they fear that what's happening there is really inspiring a whole new generation of terrorists as well. They need a place to put their anger, and that's generally how these people get inspired or pulled into these groups. When you look at Afghanistan, when you understand that the United States is due to pull out of Iraq next year, when you look at Yemen, and then you think about, not only the strength of these groups in their regions, but their ability to once again start to plot attacks in the U.S. or in places, as you mentioned, like Russia, where this is a little bit more surprising. What are you thinking in terms of the evolution in 2025, Bruce?
Well, interesting. It's interesting that you brought up Russia, because even going back to Al Qaeda's early statements 2 decades ago, they put Russia exactly in the category of infidels who they were opposed to. So it's not at all surprising that Islamist groups are attempting to operate there as well. Basically, the rundown that you gave, that's very accurate, I think suggests that there's plenty of reasons and justification for terrorism worldwide. I think it is uh, curious, but also beneficial that we haven't seen, at least in the United States, a lot of fallout in terms of terrorist attacks from Gaza. We've seen a lot of protests. We've seen a lot of activity on campuses. We've seen various public action groups mobilizing, closing down traffic, let's say, on the way to LaGuardia Airport or JFK Airport, or closing down 295 in Washington, D.C., things like that. But we haven't seen that much terrorism, fortunately. I think one of the problems that especially with the U.S. leaving Iraq, is, as a counterfactual, it would be interesting to pose the question: if the United States had not left Afghanistan, would ISIS still be in its box?
Mm.
ISIS-K was nothing 5 or 6 years ago. I mean, it was a local problem, not even a regional problem, in parts of Afghanistan that was controlled by the Afghan government and, of course, by the United States military and intelligence community that had a very modest but very critical forward-based presence there. We could ask the question, why is it that 3 or 4 years later, ISIS is again a threat? And the main threat is coming from not ISIS Central necessarily, but one of its branches, ISIS-K.
Mm-hmm.
And there has to be, I think, some correlation between the fact that we lost that ability to be on the ground very close up with a terrorist threat that, of course, was drifting into insignificance at the time because of our efforts, but that we thought we could manage from a distance. And I think that's being called into question by this half dozen, as I said, of significant ISIS plots or actually successful attacks that we've seen in the past 12 months.
Yeah, one can imagine, and I, of course, have no inside knowledge whatsoever, but one can imagine that the CIA is really looking to flood the zone in Syria to try to get some good intelligence on what's going to happen there and how these groups are going to continue to gain strength. On a note to just how complicated the world has become, though, Bruce, I want to ask you in closing, the one topic where the United States and Russia had what people will tell you was a productive conversation. They had track 2 talks on terrorism. There was cooperation, sharing of information. When you're looking at the big picture, how much of an impact do you think the deterioration of those ties and others will have, since really information sharing is so important when you're trying to stay ahead of these groups?
Huge. I think that one of the biggest success stories of the war on terror was the international cooperation that mobilized in the aftermath of the September 11th, 2001 attack, including with Syria, including with Iran at the time as well. And without that international cooperation, I think that it becomes easier for terrorists to navigate the seams or the gaps and to engage in acts of violence that affect all of us wherever it occurs, because the single terrorist attack, especially in a country that's highly prepared for terrorism or that guards against terrorism, is an incredible victory for them. I mean, this gives them greater relevance. It demonstrates their ability to penetrate even hardened targets, and creates a momentum that terrorists attempt to exploit. And not just terrorists in the same group, that inspires other groups as well, copycat type attacks, not just staged by radicalized individuals, but copycat attacks by actual terrorist organizations who seek to also steal some of the thunder for themselves. So the lack of international cooperation, I think, was one of the main factors that enables terrorists to successfully carry out attacks internationally, because they precisely take advantage of those gaps.
Bruce Hoffman, honestly, one of the smartest people I know on this topic. You spent decades of your career focused on understanding these groups, what drives them, how they operate, and you're teaching at Georgetown University. You have books that you've written on the topic. I really want to thank you for taking some time out of your day and chatting with us about the threat of terrorism in 2025 and beyond. Thanks, Bruce.
Well,
nice to see you.
You're very welcome. You're too kind. Thank you very much for speaking with me.